In this episode, we're going to focus on what happens after the initial panic fades and the organization needs real answers, not guesses. When an incident occurs, it's tempting to declare victory as soon as the obvious malicious file is removed or the suspicious account is disabled, but that is often when the real work begins. Root cause and recovery analysis is the disciplined process of determining how the incident started, how it spread, what it changed, and what must be repaired so it does not simply happen again. For brand new learners, this can sound like a huge technical exercise, but the core idea is straightforward. You build a timeline from evidence, you identify the true entry point and enabling conditions, and you restore systems in a way that removes attacker persistence and closes the holes that made the incident possible. We will organize this thinking around four major evidence perspectives: metadata, volatile data, host evidence, and network evidence. Each one offers a different angle on what happened, and together they form a stronger explanation than any single clue could provide. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A dependable root cause analysis starts with accepting that the first thing you notice is rarely the first thing that happened. Many incidents are detected late, often when an attacker reaches a noisy stage like ransomware encryption, mass password resets, or obvious data transfer, but the attacker may have been present quietly long before that. Recovery analysis fails when teams treat the first visible symptom as the cause, because they fix the symptom while leaving the original pathway open. The right mindset is to separate detection time from compromise time, and then work backward carefully. This also requires a calm definition of what root cause means, because it is not the name of the malware or the one vulnerable server you found. Root cause is the combination of initial entry method and the conditions that allowed the attacker to succeed, such as weak authentication, missing patching, misconfiguration, or excessive privileges. When you frame root cause this way, your recommendations become more meaningful because you address both the doorway and the reasons the doorway was easy to open. Metadata is often the most overlooked evidence category by beginners, yet it is frequently the first place you can find a trustworthy timeline anchor. Metadata is information about data, such as file creation times, modification times, access times, user ownership, process start times, and event timestamps recorded by systems. On its own, metadata can feel boring, but it often reveals patterns that point to cause and sequence, like when a suspicious file first appeared, whether it was modified after arrival, and whether it was executed in a way that matches the incident window. Metadata can also help you separate human activity from automated activity, because software often creates consistent and rapid patterns that humans rarely produce. A common beginner misunderstanding is thinking metadata is always accurate, when in reality some timestamps can be changed and different systems record time differently. That is why defenders compare multiple metadata sources rather than trusting a single timestamp. When metadata is used carefully, it becomes the skeleton of the incident story, giving you a structure you can test against deeper evidence. Once you have metadata anchors, you can start building an incident timeline that connects events across systems without jumping to conclusions. A timeline is not just a list of events. It is a hypothesis about sequence and causality that you refine as evidence accumulates. For example, if metadata suggests a file appeared before a suspicious login, that can change your understanding of whether the login delivered the file or the file enabled the login through credential theft. The strongest timelines use time synchronization concepts, meaning you account for how clocks may differ across systems and how logs may arrive delayed. Beginners often assume all time is the same, but in enterprise environments, clock drift and different time zones can cause confusion that leads to incorrect conclusions. A careful analyst looks for patterns that are consistent even when the exact minute might be uncertain, such as a burst of activity followed by a lull, or a clear before and after change in system behavior. This matters because recovery decisions depend on identifying what must be undone, and you cannot undo what you cannot place in time. A disciplined timeline is the bridge between raw data and confident action. Volatile data is the next major evidence type, and it matters because it captures what is true while a system is running, which can vanish when the system is rebooted or shut down. Volatile data includes things like active processes, open network connections, loaded modules, current user sessions, and data that exists in memory while programs run. Beginners sometimes treat rebooting as a safe reset, but rebooting can erase exactly the evidence that would explain how an attacker maintained control or what they were doing at the moment of discovery. Volatile evidence is especially valuable for identifying active command channels, in-memory-only threats, and short-lived scripts that may not leave obvious files behind. It can also reveal whether the attacker was still present when the response began, which influences containment decisions. Another beginner misunderstanding is thinking volatile data is only for advanced forensic teams, when the concept is relevant to anyone designing response processes. Even if you don't personally collect volatile evidence, you should understand why it is prioritized early, because once it's gone, you can't recover it later from disk. Volatile data also supports root cause analysis by revealing relationships that aren't obvious from file evidence alone. A suspicious executable on disk is a clue, but seeing it running with unusual parent processes, unusual command parameters, and unusual network connections can show you what it was actually doing. A system might contain many programs, but volatile evidence can reveal which ones were active during the incident window, which helps narrow the true set of relevant artifacts. This is also where you can see early indicators of lateral movement, such as unexpected remote sessions or tools that interact with other hosts. Beginners should understand that attackers often try to avoid leaving clean artifacts on disk by using techniques that live in memory or by using legitimate system tools in unusual ways. Volatile evidence can capture those techniques while they are happening, making it easier to determine scope and to confirm whether containment is working. In recovery planning, volatile evidence also helps you decide whether a system can be safely cleaned or whether it should be rebuilt, because evidence of deep, active manipulation suggests higher risk of hidden persistence. The more you understand volatile evidence, the less you rely on hope during response. Host evidence is the broader category of what the affected device itself can tell you through its files, logs, configurations, and local security controls. This includes user accounts, scheduled tasks, service configurations, startup items, installed software, and local policy settings, as well as the system logs that describe actions over time. Host evidence is where you look for persistence, meaning the ways an attacker ensures they can return after a reboot. And it's also where you look for privilege changes that explain how the attacker moved from a limited foothold to powerful control. Beginners sometimes assume that if the malicious file is deleted, the threat is gone, but attackers often create multiple fallback paths, such as new accounts, modified settings, or hidden scheduled execution. Host evidence is also critical for understanding initial entry if it occurred through the host, such as a malicious email attachment executed by the user, a browser download, or an exposed service on that host. The host tells the story of what ran and what changed, and those changes often reveal both the attacker's intent and the defender's gaps. Root cause analysis becomes much stronger when you can point to specific host changes that enabled the attack rather than relying on vague statements. A key part of host-based root cause work is distinguishing normal administrative activity from malicious activity that imitates administration. Attackers often use legitimate tools and built-in system capabilities because that reduces the chance of being detected by simple malware signatures. This means you can't treat every administrative action as malicious, but you also can't treat administrative actions as automatically safe. You look for unusual combinations, such as an administrative action performed by an account that rarely does that kind of work, performed at an unusual time, performed from an unusual device, or followed by actions that don't match normal maintenance patterns. Beginners sometimes feel uncomfortable making these judgments, but the discomfort is reduced when you rely on baselines and context rather than on gut feeling. Host evidence can also show whether security controls were tampered with, such as logging being disabled or defenses being weakened, which strongly suggests malicious intent. When you find that kind of tampering, recovery should assume the attacker was trying to hide and persist, which usually calls for more aggressive rebuilding and credential resets. Host evidence is therefore both detective and corrective because it tells you what happened and what you must restore. Network evidence gives you the external view, showing how systems communicated, where data flowed, and whether internal boundaries were crossed. Network evidence can include connection logs, flow records, proxy logs, firewall events, and other records that describe which hosts talk to which destinations and when. This matters because many attacks involve stages that require network communication, like initial payload download, command and control traffic, lateral movement between internal hosts, and data exfiltration. Beginners sometimes assume network evidence is only about blocking bad addresses, but in root cause and recovery, network evidence is more about reconstructing paths. It can show whether the attacker entered from outside or through a remote access path, whether the attacker later moved to other internal systems, and whether the attacker likely extracted data. Network evidence can also reveal where monitoring gaps exist, because if you cannot see certain flows, you may not be able to prove what did or did not happen. A strong recovery plan uses network evidence to determine scope, because rebuilding one host is pointless if the attacker has already spread to others. Network evidence helps you avoid that trap by showing the broader footprint. Network evidence becomes even more valuable when you connect it to the host timeline, because the combination can reveal cause and effect patterns. If the host shows a process started at a certain time and the network shows a new outbound connection from that host immediately afterward, you can connect behavior to destination and investigate whether that destination is suspicious. If you see multiple internal hosts connecting to the same unusual destination, that may indicate a common infection path or a shared compromise credential. If you see a host contacting many internal systems in a short period, that can suggest scanning or lateral movement, especially if the host normally has a narrow communication pattern. Beginners sometimes think network analysis requires deep protocol expertise, but much of the value comes from simple questions about what is normal and what changed. Network evidence is also useful for recovery verification, because after you rebuild or clean systems, you can watch for the disappearance of suspicious communication patterns. If suspicious patterns persist, that suggests the root cause is not fully addressed, perhaps because credentials remain compromised or a second persistence mechanism exists. That feedback loop is central to reliable recovery. Root cause analysis is not complete until you identify the enabling conditions that made the incident possible, because otherwise you fix one pathway and leave the underlying weakness intact. An attacker may have entered through a phishing email, but the incident became serious because the user had excessive privileges, because multi-factor authentication was missing, or because sensitive systems were reachable from the compromised endpoint. Another attacker may have entered through a known vulnerability, but the deeper cause might be a patch management gap, an asset inventory gap, or a change control process that allowed outdated systems to remain exposed. Beginners sometimes want root cause to be a single sentence, but in practice it often contains at least two parts: the entry vector and the control failure that allowed escalation or spread. This is important because recovery is not only about restoring systems, it is about restoring safety, and safety requires reducing the chance of recurrence. That means your analysis should result in changes that are measurable and verifiable, such as tightening access paths, reducing privileges, improving monitoring coverage, or accelerating patching. A root cause statement that doesn't lead to a change in controls is a story, not an analysis. Recovery analysis also includes the careful decision between cleaning systems in place and rebuilding systems from a known good state. Cleaning can be faster and less disruptive in some cases, but it can leave uncertainty if the attacker's persistence mechanisms are not fully identified. Rebuilding is often more reliable because it returns the system to a trusted baseline, but it can be disruptive and may require careful coordination with business operations. Beginners sometimes assume rebuilding is always the safest choice, but there are environments where rebuilding is complex and could cause significant downtime, so the decision must be risk-based. The key is to match the recovery approach to the level of confidence you have in the evidence. If host and volatile evidence suggest deep tampering, credential theft, or security control disabling, rebuilding becomes more attractive because hidden persistence is more likely. If evidence suggests a narrow, contained event with clear artifacts and clear removal, cleaning might be acceptable with strong follow-up monitoring. The most important point is that recovery decisions should be driven by evidence and risk, not by convenience alone. Credential recovery is often the most overlooked part of recovery analysis, yet it is one of the most important because many attacks ultimately revolve around stolen identities. If an attacker captured passwords, tokens, or keys, they may be able to return even after you rebuild the original host. This is why recovery often includes resetting credentials, revoking active sessions, rotating keys, and reviewing privileged access pathways. Beginners sometimes focus entirely on the infected machine, but attackers often treat machines as stepping stones to steal credentials that can be used elsewhere. A strong recovery plan therefore asks which accounts were used, which accounts were exposed, and what those accounts can access. It also includes reviewing whether the incident revealed a need for stronger authentication, tighter privilege models, or reduced standing administrative access. Credential recovery can be disruptive, but it is often necessary to restore trust, because you cannot confidently declare recovery if the attacker can authenticate like a legitimate user. When you connect credential recovery to your timeline and network evidence, you can prioritize resets based on actual exposure rather than resetting everything blindly. This makes recovery both more effective and more manageable. Finally, a mature root cause and recovery analysis ends with validation, meaning you confirm the environment is truly back to a trustworthy state and that the fixes actually close the pathway. Validation is not just a statement that systems are online again. It is evidence that suspicious behaviors have stopped, that logs and monitoring are functioning, and that the specific weaknesses identified as root cause are addressed. This includes confirming that rebuilt systems are using secure baselines, that segmentation and access restrictions are in place as intended, and that patching or configuration changes were applied correctly. Beginners sometimes assume validation is optional because it sounds like extra work, but without validation, you can't distinguish between recovery and temporary calm. Attackers may pause and wait, and a superficial recovery can give them time to return. The best validation combines host checks, network observations, and identity monitoring to ensure the environment behaves normally again. It also includes documenting what was learned so future incidents are handled faster and with fewer mistakes. Recovery is not complete when the noise stops. It is complete when trust is restored and verified. To conclude, performing root cause and recovery analysis is the disciplined practice of turning an incident into a clear, evidence-based understanding and a safer future state. Metadata provides the timeline skeleton that helps you place events in sequence. Volatile data reveals what was happening in the live moment and can expose short-lived attacker activity. Host evidence shows persistence and local changes that explain how control was gained and maintained, and network evidence reveals movement and communication paths that define scope and potential data exposure. The real strength comes from combining these perspectives so you don't mistake a symptom for a cause or clean one system while leaving the attacker's access intact elsewhere. Root cause analysis is complete only when you identify both the entry vector and the enabling conditions that allowed escalation and spread, and recovery is complete only when systems, credentials, and controls are restored in a way that removes persistence and closes the doors that were used. For beginners, the key takeaway is that good recovery is not a cleanup. It is a rebuilding of trust backed by evidence. When you learn to approach incidents this way, you move from reactive firefighting to resilient defense, where every incident makes the environment harder to compromise next time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.